Blood splattered across the desert sand as Mason Carter's rifle cracked against the night sky, the wolf's dying howl echoing through the canyon. Two Apache girls cowered behind him, their dark eyes reflecting the firelight as more yellow eyes gleamed in the darkness beyond. He'd already killed 3 of the beasts, but the pack was hungry, desperate, and he had only 2 bullets left. 24 hours ago, he'd been a decorated cavalry scout. Now he was a deserter, wounded and hunted, standing between innocent children and a brutal death. What happened next would change everything he thought he knew about honor, family, and the price of doing what's right. If you want to discover how this impossible choice led to a reward that defied everything Mason believed about the Apache people, stay with me until the very end. And comment below with your city so I can see how far this incredible story has traveled across the world. The muzzle flash lit up Captain William Harrow's face like the fires of hell itself, casting twisted shadows across his weathered features as he lowered his smoking Colt revolver. The Apache elder, a man whose silver hair spoke of wisdom earned through 7 decades of survival, toppled backward into the dust, his ceremonial beads scattering like drops of blood across the New Mexico desert. "Jesus Christ, Captain!" Mason Carter's voice cracked across the sudden silence that followed the gunshot. His hand instinctively moved toward his own sidearm before stopping, trembling with rage and disbelief. He was unarmed. They came under a white flag. Harrow's cold blue eyes swept across the massacre scene before them. 7 Apache leaders lay dead or dying around the council fire, their peace pipes still clutched in lifeless fingers. The smell of gunpowder mixed with the copper scent of blood and the lingering smoke of sage that had been burning moments before in a sacred ceremony of proposed truce. "Orders are orders, Carter." Harrow spat, holstering his weapon with practiced indifference. "Command wants this territory cleared. Every last red-skinned devil that stands between us and progress." He gestured toward the fallen men with casual dismissal. These weren't innocents seeking peace. They were buying time to gather their war parties. Mason stared at the bodies, his stomach churning. Among the dead was Nahali, the same Apache elder who had once saved his life during a flash flood 3 summers ago. The old man had shared his food, tended Mason's wounds, and before parting ways had pressed a smooth obsidian arrowhead into his palm. "Tarak Nilchi," the elder had said, in broken English, his ancient eyes twinkling with something Mason couldn't quite understand. "Spirit arrow. For man who see with heart, not just eyes. You keep. When darkness come, it show you true path." Mason had carried that arrowhead ever since, more as a curiosity than any belief in its power. Now, as he looked down at Nahali's peaceful face frozen in death, the obsidian seemed to burn against his chest, where it hung on a leather cord beneath his blue cavalry shirt. "Mount up," Harrow barked to the dozen soldiers who had formed the ambush circle. "We've got 10 miles to cover before we make camp, and I want to be clear of this area before any of their scouts find this mess." The other men began moving with the efficiency of long practice, checking their weapons and preparing to ride. Mason remained frozen, his horse's reins slack in his hands, as he continued staring at the carnage. "Carter," Harrow's voice cut through his paralysis like a whip crack. "I said mount up. We've got a schedule to keep." "This wasn't a military operation," Mason said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "This was murder." The words hung in the air like smoke, and every soldier in the patrol went still. In the frontier army, there were things you could say and things that could get you shot for treason. Mason had just crossed that line. Harrow's face went rigid, his hand drifting back toward his gun. "What did you say, Scout?" Mason turned to face his commanding officer, and for the first time in 5 years of military service, he didn't salute. The obsidian arrowhead seemed to pulse with warmth against his chest as he met Harrow's gaze without flinching. "I said this was murder, sir, cold-blooded murder of men who came here in good faith to negotiate peace." His voice grew stronger with each word. men who trusted in the honor of the United States Army. The only honor in this territory belongs to the men willing to secure it for civilization, Harrow snarled. These savages understand only one language, violence. Today we spoke it fluently. Nahale understood 3 languages, including ours, better than half the men in this patrol, Mason shot back. He was a healer, a peacemaker. He was a dead Indian, Harrow interrupted coldly, which makes him a good Indian by my measure. Now mount your horse before I decide you're as much a problem as they were. The threat was clear, and Mason could see several of the other soldiers shifting uncomfortably. These weren't bad men, most of them just soldiers following orders in a land where questioning authority could mean death. But they were also men who had seen too much violence, men who had learned to survive by shutting down the part of themselves that asked difficult questions. Mason looked around the circle of faces. Young Private Henderson, who still wrote letters to his mother every week. Sergeant Kowalski, who had saved Mason's life during the Apache Canyon skirmish last spring. Corporal Martinez, who carried a picture of his wife and newborn son in his breast pocket. Good men who had made the same choice he was being asked to make. Close your eyes, follow orders, and don't think too hard about the blood on your hands. The obsidian arrowhead grew warmer. No, Mason said simply. The word fell between them like a stone dropped into still water, creating ripples that seemed to spread across the desert itself. Harrow's eyes widened slightly, not in surprise, but in the dawning realization that he was about to kill another man today. No, Harrow repeated softly. Did you just refuse a direct order, Scout Carter? I refuse to be part of this. Mason clarified, his hand now resting openly on his revolver's grip. I refuse to pretend this was anything other than what it was. And I refuse to ride with men who think honor means gunning down unarmed elders who came here seeking peace. Then you're a deserter, Harrow said, his own weapon halfway clear of its holster. And deserters get shot. Captain, Sergeant Kowalski interrupted carefully. Maybe we should stay out of this, Sergeant, Harrow snapped, never taking his eyes off Mason. This man just committed treason in front of witnesses. There's only one response to that. Mason knew he had perhaps 2 seconds before bullets started flying. In that frozen moment, time seemed to slow, and he became acutely aware of everything around him. The whisper of wind through the sage brush, the nervous stamping of horses smelling blood, the way the dying sunlight painted the desert rocks, the color of dried blood. The arrowhead against his chest was almost hot now. With reflexes honed by 5 years of frontier warfare, Mason drew and fired in one fluid motion, his bullet taking Harrow's hat clean off his head. Before anyone could react, he had rolled behind his horse, using the animal's body as cover while he put spurs to its flanks. Son of a bitch! Harrow roared, completing his own draw and sending a bullet screaming past Mason's ear as the scout's horse launched into a full gallop. Kill him! Kill the deserting bastard! The desert erupted in gunfire as 11 soldiers opened up on their former comrade. Mason crouched low over his horse's neck, feeling bullets whine past his head and punch holes in his saddle. His mount, a tough frontier Mustang named Jake, stretched into a dead run, powerful legs eating up ground as they raced toward the broken country of mesas and canyons that lay to the east. A bullet creased Mason's left shoulder, spinning him partially around in the saddle, but not unseating him. Another shot shattered his canteen precious water, spraying across the desert as they rode. Behind him he could hear Harrow screaming orders to mount up and give chase. Ride, Jake, Mason whispered into his horse's ear, tasting blood where he had bitten his tongue during the first moments of their desperate flight. Ride like the devil himself is behind us. The Mustang seemed to understand, finding reserves of speed that carried them into the maze of red rock formations that marked the beginning of the Badlands. Behind them, the sound of pursuit grew fainter as Mason guided Jake through narrow passages between towering sandstone pillars that rose like ancient monuments from the desert floor. For 2 hours they rode hard, winding deeper into country that seemed to exist outside of time itself. The sun sank toward the western horizon, painting the rock formations in shades of gold and crimson that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. Mason's shoulder throbbed where the bullet had grazed him, his shirt sticky with blood, but he didn't dare stop to tend the wound. As full darkness settled over the desert, Mason finally allowed Jake to slow to a walk. The horse was breathing hard, foam flecking his sides, but his ears remained alert for sounds of pursuit. They were deep in Apache country, now a land of hidden springs and secret trails that the cavalry patrols rarely penetrated. Mason slumped forward in his saddle, exhaustion and blood loss finally catching up with him. The events of the day seemed to replay in his mind like a fever dream: the peace council, the massacre, his decision to stand against his own commanding officer. Everything he had been: a decorated scout, a loyal soldier, a man with a purpose and a place in the world, had been stripped away in the space of a few minutes. "What the hell have I done, Jake?" he whispered to his horse. The Mustang's only response was to continue picking his way carefully through the rocky terrain, trusting his footing to instincts developed over years of hard travel. The obsidian arrowhead had cooled against Mason's chest, but he could still feel its weight like a physical reminder of the choice he had made. He pulled it out, holding it up to catch the starlight that was beginning to pierce the desert darkness. The stone was perfectly black, polished, smooth as glass, with edges sharp enough to cut. In the Apache tradition, obsidian was sacred, a gift from the earth spirits that could cut through deception to reveal truth. "When darkness come, it show you true path." Mason repeated Nahale's words aloud, his voice barely a whisper, in the vast emptiness of the desert night. "Well, old man, I hope you were right, because I sure as hell can't see any path from here." As if in response to his words, Jake's ears suddenly pricked forward and the horse nickered softly. Mason raised his head, following his mount's gaze toward a distant flickering light that seemed to dance between the rock formations ahead. A campfire, perhaps a mile away, hidden in what looked like a natural amphitheater formed by 3 converging canyon walls. Mason's hand moved instinctively to his rifle, checking its load while his eyes strained to make out any details about the distant camp. It could be anyone: cavalry patrol, Apache war party, Mexican bandits, or simple travelers. In this country, any encounter with strangers was potentially fatal. But Jake seemed drawn toward the light, his steps quickening with the subtle eagerness of a horse that sensed water nearby. And Mason suddenly realized he was desperately thirsty, his destroyed canteen leaving him without any liquid to replace what he had lost through blood and sweat during their flight. "Easy, boy," he murmured, guiding Jake to higher ground where they could observe the distant camp without being seen. "Let's see what we're dealing with before we go calling on strangers." From a ridge overlooking the hidden canyon, Mason could make out the details of the camp below. A small fire burned in the center of a cleared space, its light revealing 2 figures huddled close together for warmth. Their clothing and long black hair identified them as Apache, but something was wrong with the scene. Mason had encountered Apache camps before, and they were usually bustling with activity. Even at night, guards posted, horses picketed in defensive positions, weapons kept close at hand. This camp looked abandoned, except for those 2 solitary figures, and as Mason watched, he realized they were much smaller than adult Apache warriors would be. Children, he thought. 2 children alone in the desert with nothing but a small fire for protection. As he watched, one of the figures suddenly stood and pointed toward the darkness beyond the firelight. Mason couldn't hear what was said, but the body language was unmistakable: fear, panic, the rigid posture of someone who had spotted mortal danger approaching. Then he heard it, the howling. It started as a single voice, low and mournful, echoing off the canyon walls. Within seconds, it was joined by others, 5, 6, maybe 7 distinct voices harmonizing in the ancient song that meant death for anything weak enough to be caught alone in the desert night. Wolves. Mason cursed under his breath as the howling grew closer. Wolves were rare in this part of the territory, but drought and the disruption of traditional hunting grounds had driven some packs to desperate measures. A pack large enough to tackle human prey meant they hadn't eaten in days, possibly weeks, and those 2 children had just become the most accessible meal in 50 square miles of desert. "Damn it," Mason muttered, checking his weapons again. He had his rifle with the full magazine, his revolver with 5 shots remaining after the confrontation with Harrow, and a hunting knife that his father had given him before he left Pennsylvania for the frontier. Against a hungry wolf pack, it might be enough if he was lucky and very, very careful. Jake danced nervously under him as the howling grew closer, and Mason could see the children below frantically trying to build up their fire with whatever scraps of wood they could find. But there wasn't much fuel in this barren country, and their fire was already burning low. The smart thing to do would be to ride away. Mason was a deserter now, hunted by his own army, and probably marked for death by every Apache band in the territory once word of the massacre spread. Getting involved in a fight to save 2 Indian children would only complicate his already desperate situation. But as he watched the smaller of the 2 figures, a girl who couldn't have been more than 8 years old, pick up a stick to use as a weapon against creatures that could tear her apart without effort, Mason felt the obsidian arrowhead grow warm against his chest again. Spirit arrow, for man who see with heart, not just eyes. "Ah, hell," Mason said quietly, then spurred Jake toward the narrow trail that led down into the canyon. "Come on, boy. Looks like we're about to make some new friends." The descent into the canyon took precious minutes that Mason knew they couldn't spare. The howling was practically on top of the camp now, and he could see yellow eyes reflecting firelight as shapes moved in the darkness beyond the children's small circle of safety. Mason reached the canyon floor just as the first wolf broke from the shadows, a massive gray male with ribs showing through his matted fur and the desperate cunning of an apex predator pushed to the edge of starvation. The beast had focused on the smaller child, the girl who had been trying to wave her pathetic stick at the encroaching darkness. The wolf's leap would have carried it straight to her throat if Mason's rifle shot hadn't taken it in midair, the .44-40 bullet punching through its chest and sending it tumbling end over end into the rocks beyond the fire. The crack of the gunshot echoed off the canyon walls like thunder, momentarily stunning both the remaining wolves and the children they had been stalking. "Get behind me," Mason shouted to the 2 youngsters as he swung down from Jake's saddle, working the lever of his rifle to chamber a fresh round. "Stay close and keep that fire going." The larger child, a boy of perhaps 10 with fierce dark eyes that reminded Mason of Nahele, grabbed his smaller companion and pulled her toward Mason's position. They moved with the fluid grace of children raised in country where a moment's clumsiness could mean death, but Mason could see the terror in their faces as more wolves emerged from the surrounding darkness. These weren't the cautious, intelligent wolves of normal times. Starvation had made them reckless, desperate enough to attack a mounted man with a rifle rather than retreat to find easier prey. Mason counted at least 6 distinct shapes circling the fire, their eyes reflecting the flames like hellish stars as they tested the boundaries of the light. A second wolf made its move, rushing from Mason's left side in an attempt to flank him while his attention was focused on the pack leader. Mason spun and fired, but his shot went high in the darkness, chipping sparks from the canyon wall as the beast closed the distance between them. He had just enough time to reverse his grip on the rifle and swing it like a club, the wooden stock connecting with the wolf's skull in a meaty impact that sent the animal sprawling. But the blow had shattered his rifle stock, leaving him with a weapon that was now useless except as an awkward club. "Mister," the boy shouted, pointing toward Mason's right, "behind you." Mason spun to see two more wolves coordinating their attack, approaching from different angles to divide his attention. His hand went to his revolver, drawing and firing in one smooth motion that dropped the first animal with a bullet through its heart. The second beast leaped just as Mason's hammer fell on an empty chamber. The wolf's weight slammed into him, driving him backward toward the fire as yellow fangs snapped inches from his face. Mason managed to get his forearm up, feeling teeth tear through his shirt sleeve as he rolled with the impact. The hunting knife came free from his belt, and he drove it upward with desperate strength, feeling the blade punch through fur and hide to find the wolf's heart. The animal went limp, its weight pinning Mason to the ground, as warm blood soaked through his already ruined shirt. He shoved the carcass aside and scrambled to his feet, looking around for the remaining members of the pack. Two more sets of eyes gleamed in the darkness beyond the fire, but these wolves had learned caution from the fate of their packmates. They paced back and forth at the edge of the light, whining and snarling, but no longer willing to commit to a direct assault. Mason reloaded his revolver with hands that shook slightly from adrenaline, keeping his eyes on the remaining predators while he tried to assess the situation. 4 wolves dead, at least 2 still alive, and probably others he couldn't see in the darkness. His rifle was ruined. He was down to his last few pistol bullets, and the children were looking at him with expressions that mixed gratitude with understandable wariness. "You speak English?" he asked the older boy, not taking his eyes off the wolves that continued to pace just beyond rifle range. The boy nodded slowly. "Some. Grandmother teach me. She say, white man words, important to know." "Good. What are your names?" "I am Naalnish," the boy replied, then gestured to the girl who was clinging to his arm. "She is Ashki, sister." Mason nodded, filing away the names while he continued watching for any sign that the wolves might renew their attack. "I'm Mason. How long have you been out here alone?" Naalnish's expression clouded with pain. 3 days, grandmother. She die, coughing sickness. Before she die, she tell us go to mother. Mother live with Wakiza's people 2 days walk toward morning sun." "Your mother isn't with you?" The boy shook his head. "Mother is medicine woman. She go with war chief when white soldiers come to our winter camp. She leave us with grandmother, say she come back when fighting done. But grandmother gets sick and soldiers come closer every day. So grandmother tell us run. Find mother before soldiers find us." Mason felt a chill that had nothing to do with the desert night air. If these children had been traveling for 3 days toward the east, they were heading directly into the territory where Harrow's patrol had been operating. The white soldiers the boy mentioned were probably the same cavalry units that had massacred the Peace Council just hours ago. "Naalnish," Mason said carefully, "did your grandmother tell you anything about white soldiers meeting with Apache leaders, a peace council?" The boy's eyes widened with sudden understanding. "Nahele. Grandmother say Nahele go speak peace words with white soldier chief. She say maybe fighting stop, maybe our people come home." His expression shifted to confusion and growing fear. "You know of this?" Mason closed his eyes briefly, feeling the weight of what he would have to tell these children. When he opened them again, both youngsters were staring at him with the intensity of people who had learned to read danger in every gesture, every expression. "I was there," Mason said quietly. "I was with the white soldiers when they met your Nahel and the other leaders." He didn't need to say more. The expression on Naalnish's face told him that the boy had read the truth in his voice, in his posture, in the haunted look that Mason knew must be visible in his eyes. "He dead," Naalnish whispered, and it wasn't a question. Mason nodded slowly. "I'm sorry. They all are. The soldiers. They didn't come to make peace. They came to kill." Ashki, who had remained silent throughout their conversation, suddenly spoke up in rapid Apache, her voice high and frightened. Naalnish listened, then turned back to Mason with an expression that was far too mature for his young face. "She asked why you help us if you were with soldiers who kill our people." It was a fair question, and one that Mason wasn't sure he could answer in a way that would make sense to children who had just learned that their world had become infinitely more and more dangerous. "Because killing your leaders was wrong," Mason said finally. "Because I couldn't stand by and watch it happen. Because—" He paused, touching the obsidian arrowhead beneath his shirt. "Because your Nahel once saved my life, and he gave me something that I think was meant to help me find the right path when everything else got confused." As if summoned by his words, one of the remaining wolves chose that moment to make a desperate charge from the darkness, its gaunt form hurtling toward Ashki with the last reserves of its strength. Mason's revolver barked, once the bullet taking the animal's center mass and dropping it in a tangle of limbs just feet from where the little girl stood. The final wolf, apparently deciding that easier prey might be found elsewhere, melted back into the desert night with a parting howl that sounded almost mournful as it echoed off the canyon walls. Mason holstered his weapon and looked around at the carnage surrounding their small camp. 6 dead wolves lay scattered around the fire, their blood dark in the flickering light. His clothes were torn and bloody, his rifle was ruined, and he was down to his last 2 bullets. But the children were alive. "We need to move," Mason said, kicking dirt over the fire to extinguish it. "That gunfire will carry for miles in this country. If there are soldiers nearby, they'll be coming to investigate." Nalnish nodded his understanding. "We go to find Mother." Mason looked at the 2 children alone, vulnerable, traveling through a war zone toward a destination that might no longer exist if the army had expanded their killing beyond the Peace Council. Everything logical told him to part ways with them here. They would slow him down, make him more visible to pursuit, and complicate his own chances of survival. But as he looked at Ashki's trusting face and Nailnish's determined expression, he felt the obsidian arrowhead pulse with warmth once more against his chest. "Spirit arrow, for man who see with heart, not just eyes. When darkness come, it show you true path." "Yeah," Mason said, surprising himself with the firmness in his voice. "We go find your mother, all of us together." As he helped the children gather their few belongings and prepared to mount Jake for the journey ahead, Mason Carter realized that his life as a cavalry scout, and perhaps his life as a white man in Apache country, was truly over. Whatever lay ahead of them in the desert would require him to become something entirely different. The question was whether he could become it fast enough to keep them all alive. The last thing Mason saw as they rode out of the canyon was the gleam of yellow eyes watching them from the darkness. Not wolves this time, but something that might prove even more dangerous in the long run. Human eyes belonging to someone who had witnessed the entire encounter and was now following them into the desert night. Behind them, carried on the desert wind, came the distant sound of approaching hoofbeats. The pursuit had found their trail. The hoofbeats grew closer as Mason urged Jake through the narrow passage. Between 2 towering mesas, the children pressed against him in the saddle. Naalnish rode behind Mason, his small arms wrapped tightly around the scout's waist, while Ashki sat in front, her head barely reaching Mason's chest. The Mustang moved with careful precision through the treacherous terrain, his hooves finding purchase on loose shale that could send them all tumbling into the canyon below with one misstep. "How many follow us?" Naalnish whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of Jake's breathing and the scrape of hooves on stone. Mason strained to listen to the pursuit behind them. The echoes off the canyon walls made it difficult to judge distance, but he could make out at least 4 distinct sets of hoofbeats, maybe more. "Enough," he replied grimly. "Too many for us to fight if they catch us in open ground." The irony wasn't lost on him. 12 hours ago, those men had been his brothers in arms. Now, they were hunting him like a rabid animal through country that held 1,000 ways to die. And he was responsible for 2 children who would be shown no mercy if Harrow's patrol caught up with them. Jake stumbled slightly on a patch of loose rock, and Ashki made a small sound of fear. Mason steadied her with one arm while guiding the horse with the other, feeling the animal's growing exhaustion in every labored step. They had been riding hard for hours, first fleeing the massacre site and then escaping the wolf attack. Even Jake's legendary endurance had limits, and they were approaching them fast. "There," Nalnish said, suddenly pointing toward a dark shadow in the canyon wall ahead. "Cave. Grandmother tells stories of hiding places in this country. Maybe we lose them in there." Mason studied the opening with experienced eyes. It looked like a natural formation worn by centuries of flash floods and wind erosion. Large enough for a horse and 3 riders, but narrow enough that they wouldn't be visible from more than 50 yards away. More importantly, it appeared to angle back into the mesa, which might provide multiple passages and escape routes. "Good eye," Mason said, guiding Jake toward the cave entrance. "Your grandmother taught you well." As they approached the opening, Mason could see that it extended much deeper into the rock than he had initially thought. Cool air flowed from its depths, carrying the scent of water and something else, the lingering smell of wood smoke that suggested others had used this hiding place recently. Jake balked at the cave entrance, his ears flicking nervously as he tested the air with flaring nostrils. The horse had survived the frontier by trusting his instincts, and those instincts were telling him that something wasn't right about this particular shelter. "Easy boy," Mason murmured, but he loosened his revolver in its holster as he urged the Mustang forward. Whatever was in that cave, they didn't have much choice but to face it. The sound of pursuit was growing louder, and they needed to get out of sight before Harrow's men rounded the next bend in the canyon. The cave mouth swallowed them in darkness, Jake's hooves echoing off stone walls that seemed to stretch away into impenetrable blackness. Mason let his eyes adjust while listening for any sound that might indicate they weren't alone. After a long moment, he heard it, the soft whisper of breathing that didn't belong to any of them. "Someone here," Nalnish whispered, his body tensing against Mason's back. Before Mason could respond, a voice spoke from the darkness ahead of them, speaking in rapid Apache. The words were too fast for Mason to follow, but he caught the tone, cautious questioning but not immediately hostile. Nalnish replied in the same language, his young voice carrying notes of respect and careful diplomacy. Mason could only wait while the two voices went back and forth, acutely aware that his life and the lives of the children might depend on whatever negotiation was taking place in words he couldn't understand. Finally, Nalnish leaned forward and spoke quietly in English. "Old woman, she say this sacred place protected by spirits. She ask why we bring Bilagana here." He paused. "That mean white man." "What did you tell her?" "I tell her you save us from wolves, that you enemy of soldiers who kill peace council. She want to see your face to judge if you speak truth or lies." A scraping sound came from deeper in the cave, followed by the faint glow of light as someone struck flint to tinder. A small fire flickered to life, illuminating the weathered face of an Apache woman who appeared to be somewhere past 70 years old. Her gray hair was braided with strips of leather decorated with turquoise beads, and her dark eyes held the sharp intelligence of someone who had survived by reading the truth in men's hearts. She studied Mason's face for a long moment, her gaze moving from his torn and bloodied clothes to the children pressed against him, then finally settling on the obsidian arrowhead that had worked its way outside his shirt during their desperate flight. Her eyes widened slightly when she saw the stone, and she spoke rapidly to Nalnish in Apache. The boy listened intently, then turned to Mason with an expression of surprise. "She know this arrow. She say it belong to Nahale, that he give only to man he trust with sacred power. She ask how you come to have it." Mason touched the arrowhead gently, remembering the old man's words as he pressed it into his palm 3 summers ago. "Nahale saved my life once. When he gave me this, he said it would show me the true path when darkness came. I think maybe he knew something like this would happen someday." Nalnish translated, and the old woman nodded slowly. She spoke again, her voice carrying a note of sadness that needed no translation. She say Nahale dream of this time. He see vision of white soldier who choose honor over tribe, who walk between two worlds to protect innocent ones. She say you are Tarak Nilchi, one who protects in darkness. Before Mason could respond to this revelation, the sound of approaching hoofbeats echoed from the canyon outside. Multiple riders were moving at a canter, their horses' hooves ringing against stone as they approached the cave entrance. The old woman moved with surprising speed, kicking dirt over her small fire and plunging them back into darkness. She whispered urgently to Nilnish, who translated in barely audible words. She say there is back way out of cave, but we must go deeper first. Follow her, stay quiet, and trust in spirits to hide us from enemies. Mason dismounted carefully, feeling his way through the darkness while keeping one hand on Jake's bridle and the other on Ashki's shoulder. The little girl had remained remarkably calm throughout their ordeal, but he could feel her trembling now as the sound of pursuit grew louder outside. The old woman moved through the cave with the confidence of long familiarity, leading them deeper into passages that seemed to twist and branch like the roots of some enormous underground tree. Mason lost all sense of direction as they followed her through the maze, trusting completely in her knowledge of this hidden sanctuary. Behind them, voices echoed from the cave entrance, harsh, commanding voices speaking in English. Harrow's patrol had found their hiding place. "Spread out and search every inch of this hole." Harrow's voice carried clearly through the stone passages. "They came this way and there's no other way out. We've got them trapped like rats." Mason felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cool cave air. If Harrow was wrong about there being no other way out, they might escape. If he was right, they were about to be cornered with nowhere to run. The old woman stopped suddenly, placing a hand on Mason's arm to halt their progress. She whispered something to Nalnish, who passed along her words with barely controlled excitement. "She say there is place here where spirits speak. If we very quiet, we can hear everything in cave, but they cannot hear us. She want to listen, learn what soldiers plan." They crouched in what felt like a natural chamber. The stone walls curved around them like a giant's cupped hands. Mason could indeed hear voices from throughout the cave system, the acoustics carrying even whispered conversations with startling clarity. "Tracks lead straight back here, but then they just disappear," one soldier was saying. "It's like they vanished into the rock itself." "Indians know all kinds of tricks," Harrow's voice replied. "Secret passages, hidden chambers. Keep looking. Check every shadow, every crevice. They're in here somewhere." "What about the horse tracks, Captain? They definitely came in here, but I don't see how a horse could go much deeper into these passages." Mason felt his heart sink. Jake's hoofprints would be clearly visible in the soft dirt at the cave entrance, and a trained tracker would be able to follow their path to wherever the stone became too rough for clear impressions. It was only a matter of time before the search revealed their location. "Sir," another voice spoke up, younger and more uncertain. "Maybe we should consider that they might have gotten past us somehow. These canyons have passages we don't know about." "Private Henderson," Harrow's voice carried a note of cold menace. "Are you suggesting that a deserter and 2 Indian children outsmarted an entire cavalry patrol?" "No, sir, but—" "Then keep searching, and remember what I told you about Carter. He's not the man you thought you knew. He's a traitor who chose savages over his own kind. When we find him, he gets shot on sight. No questions, no surrender, no trial. The children, too, they're witnesses to what happened at the Peace Council. And we can't afford to have them spreading stories about how their precious leaders died." Mason closed his eyes, feeling the full weight of what his decision had cost them all. It wasn't enough that he had thrown away his own life and career. Now these innocent children would pay the price for his moment of conscience. The smart thing to do would be to surrender himself, try to bargain for the children's lives with his own. But he knew Harrow too well. The captain had crossed a line today that couldn't be uncrossed. He would kill them all to protect his secret, then report that they had died resisting arrest. The old woman whispered something to Nalnish, who leaned close to Mason's ear. She say there is way out, but very dangerous. Passage goes down into water flows under mountain to hidden spring. If water too high, we drown. If water too low, we get stuck in tunnel and die slow. But she thinks spirits favor us today. How does she know about this passage? Mason whispered back. After a brief exchange in Apache, Nalnish replied, She say her husband find it 40 years ago when hiding from Mexican soldiers who burn their winter camp. He almost drown learning secret way, but he make it through. She never try it herself, but she remember his words about how to find the path. Mason weighed their options quickly, stay and almost certainly be killed by Harrow's patrol, or risk drowning in an underground river trying to escape through a passage that might not even be passable. It wasn't much of a choice. Ask her if Jake can make it through. Another whispered conversation, then Nalnish shook his head sadly. Horse too big. Tunnel only wide enough for people. She say we must leave him here, hope spirits protect him. The thought of abandoning Jake felt like another betrayal. The Mustang had carried him faithfully through 5 years of frontier warfare, had trusted him enough to follow him into this cave despite his own instincts warning of danger. But there was no alternative. They couldn't take him where they needed to go. Mason reached out in the darkness, finding Jake's muzzle and stroking it gently while he whispered words of apology and farewell. The horse nickered softly, as if understanding that their partnership was ending. He good horse, Nalnish whispered. In Apache way, horse that serve faithfully, earn honor in next world. Spirits will remember his loyalty. The sound of searching soldiers was growing closer, their voices echoing through passages that seemed to be leading directly toward their hiding place. Mason could hear Sergeant Kowalski's voice, now giving directions to the other men, as they systematically explored every branch of the cave system. This way, the old woman whispered, rising to her feet and moving deeper into the chamber. Mason felt air moving against his face as they approached what must be another passage, this one slanting downward at a steep angle. The sound of running water grew louder as they descended, the passage becoming narrower with each step, until Mason had to turn sideways to fit through some of the tighter spots. Behind him he could hear Ashki's quick breathing as she tried to keep up, and Nalnish's whispered encouragements as he helped guide his sister through the treacherous passage. They emerged into a larger chamber where the sound of water was almost deafening. Mason could feel spray on his face and hear the rush of a considerable stream flowing somewhere nearby in the darkness. The old woman struck her flint again, creating just enough light for them to see their surroundings. They stood on a narrow ledge beside an underground river that disappeared into a tunnel barely wide enough for a single person. The water level looked manageable, not so high that they would be completely submerged, but high enough that they would be fighting the current every foot of the way. She say we go one at a time, Nalnish translated. Hold to rope, count to 100, then next person follow. If rope goes slack, that mean person in front find trouble. Wait for signal before going on. The old woman was already pulling a length of braided leather cord from beneath her clothing, testing its strength with practiced hands. She tied one end around her waist, then handed the other end to Mason. She spoke again, her voice carrying notes of both blessing and warning. Nalnish listened intently, then passed along her words. She say water tunnel go maybe 200 steps through mountain heart. Air pockets every 50 steps where we can rest and breathe. But some places water go overhead, must swim and hold breath. At end tunnel come up in hidden spring where her people gather medicine plants. From there one day walk to where your mother wait with Wakiza's band. Ashki looked up at Mason with wide eyes, clearly frightened by the prospect of swimming through dark tunnels beneath tons of rock. He knelt down beside her, speaking as gently as he could manage, while the sound of approaching soldiers echoed from the passages behind them. "I know you're scared," he said softly. "I'm scared too, but your grandmother trusted you to be brave, and your mother is waiting for you to come home. Can you be brave a little longer?" The little girl nodded solemnly, then surprised him by reaching out to touch the obsidian arrowhead at his throat. She spoke in Apache, her young voice carrying a strange note of certainty. She says, "Spirit arrow, choose you to bring us home." Nalnish translated with wonder in his voice. "She says she not afraid anymore because Nahele's spirit watching over us." Before Mason could respond, the old woman was lowering herself into the rushing water with the fluid grace of someone who had spent a lifetime adapting to harsh conditions. The current immediately caught her, but she maintained her grip on the ledge while testing the tunnel entrance. She called back softly to Nalnish, who translated her report. "Water chest deep, very cold, current strong but not too strong for careful swimming. She go now, we follow when rope signal safe." Mason watched the leather cord play out through his hands as the old woman disappeared into the tunnel. The line grew taut as she fought the current, then went slack for a moment before tightening again. He counted the seconds, trying to imagine her progress through the flooded passage. When the rope jerked twice, the agreed-upon signal that she had reached the first air pocket safely, Mason felt a moment of relief. But they still had to make the journey themselves, and he wasn't sure how well the children would handle the ordeal of swimming through pitch-black tunnels while fighting a current that wanted to smash them against not stone walls. "You go next," Mason told Nalnish. "I'll come last with Ashki. Make sure she doesn't fall behind." The boy shook his head firmly. "Apache way warrior, protect others, not hide behind them. I go last. You take sister, keep her safe." Mason was about to argue when the sound of voices suddenly grew much louder in the passages behind them. The soldiers had found the chamber where they had been hiding, and it wouldn't be long before they discovered the passage leading down to the underground river. "No time to argue," Mason said grimly, lifting Ashki in his arms as he prepared to enter the water. "Nalnish, you follow close behind us. If anything happens to me, you get your sister to safety, understand?" The boy nodded, his young face set with determination that reminded Mason painfully of the Apache warriors he had fought alongside and against during his years on the frontier. Mason slipped into the water, gasping as the shock of cold hit his injured body. The current was stronger than he had expected, immediately trying to sweep him downstream toward the tunnel mouth. He fought to maintain his footing while adjusting Ashki's position so she could keep her head above water. "Hold tight to me," he whispered to the little girl. "Whatever happens, don't let go." She wrapped her arms around his neck with surprising strength, her body trembling from cold and fear, but her grip steady and determined. Mason took one last deep breath of cave air, then pushed off from the ledge and let the current carry them into the tunnel. The darkness was absolute, more complete than anything Mason had ever experienced. He kept one hand on the tunnel wall to guide their progress, while using his legs to fend off the rocky bottom and sides. The water was deeper than the old woman had indicated, sometimes rising to Mason's chin and forcing Ashki to hold her breath for long seconds at a time. The first air pocket came as a blessed relief, a small chamber where the tunnel roof rose just high enough for them to stand with their heads above water. Mason counted to 50, giving them both time to catch their breath before pushing on toward the next section. Behind them, he could hear splashing as Naalnish followed their path through the flooded tunnel. The boy was smaller and lighter, able to move more quickly through the water, but also more vulnerable to being swept away by the current if he lost his grip on the guide rope. The second section of tunnel seemed to go on forever. Mason's legs began to cramp from the constant kicking needed to keep them on course, and his wounded shoulder throbbed with each stroke. Ashki's grip around his neck was becoming weaker, her small body losing heat rapidly in the frigid water. When they finally reached the second air pocket, Mason had to lift Ashki completely out of the water to keep her from going under. She was shivering violently, her lips blue with cold, but she hadn't complained once during the ordeal. "Almost there," Mason whispered to her, hoping it was true. The old woman had said the tunnel was roughly 200 steps long, and he estimated they had covered about half that distance. But the current was growing stronger as they moved deeper under the mountain, making each step more difficult than the last. The third section nearly killed them. Mason lost his footing in a sudden deep spot and went completely under, Ashki still clinging to his neck as they both tumbled through the churning water. For a terrifying moment, Mason couldn't tell which direction was up, the tunnel walls seeming to close in from all sides as the current battered them against the rock. His lungs were burning for air when his hand finally found the tunnel roof, allowing him to push upward until they broke the surface in another small air pocket. Ashki was unconscious, her body limp in his arms, and Mason's heart stopped for a moment before he felt the faint flutter of her breathing. Ashki. Nalnish's voice echoed from behind them, tight with fear for his sister. She's alive, Mason called back, though he wasn't sure how much longer that would remain true. The little girl was suffering from exposure and exhaustion, and they still had at least 50 more steps to go through increasingly dangerous water. Mason made a decision that might have been wisdom, or might have been desperation. Instead of resting in the air pocket, he pushed immediately into the final section of tunnel, determined to reach safety before Ashki's condition could deteriorate further. The current in this last stretch was ferocious, strong enough to tear his grip loose from the guide rope twice before he managed to secure it around his wrist. Mason found himself swimming as much as walking, fighting to keep Ashki's head above water while the tunnel walls seemed to close in around them like the throat of some enormous beast. When light finally appeared ahead, actual daylight filtering down through clear water, Mason almost sobbed with relief. The tunnel mouth opened into a natural pool surrounded by smooth rocks and fed by a spring that bubbled up from deep underground. Desert willows grew around the edges of the pool, their green leaves creating patches of welcome shade in the harsh landscape beyond. Mason hauled himself and Ashki out of the water, collapsing on the sun-warmed rocks while he checked the little girl for signs of serious injury. Her breathing was shallow but steady, and her skin was beginning to regain some of its normal color as the desert heat worked to warm her. Nalnish emerged from the tunnel a few moments later, followed closely by the old woman who had guided them through the underground maze. The boy immediately went to his sister, speaking to her in rapid Apache, while he checked her condition with the practiced concern of someone who had been caring for others despite his own young age. The old woman studied the surrounding landscape with experienced eyes, then spoke to Nalnish in their native tongue. The boy listened intently, nodding his understanding before turning to Mason. She says soldiers cannot follow us here. Water tunnel only go one-way current, too strong to swim against. But we cannot stay long. This place known to her people, and some may not welcome Bilajana, even if he friend to Apache children. Mason nodded, understanding the delicate position he was in. Every choice he made now would have consequences he couldn't fully predict, and the children's safety depended on his ability to navigate a world where he was no longer welcome anywhere. As Ashki slowly regained consciousness, her dark eyes focusing on Mason's face with recognition and trust, he felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a physical burden. These children had lost everything: their grandmother, their home, their sense of safety in the world. All they had left was their faith that he could somehow get them to their mother alive. The obsidian arrowhead pulsed with warmth against his chest, and Mason found himself remembering Nahile's words about the true path becoming clear when darkness fell. Perhaps this was what the old Apache leader had foreseen, not just the massacre at the Peace Council, but this moment when a white soldier would have to choose between survival and honor, between the easy path and the right one. "We need to move," Mason said, helping Ashki to her feet. "Your grandmother said your mother is with Wakiza's people 1 day's walk from here. Can you manage that far?" Ashki nodded solemnly, still too weak to speak but determined not to slow them down. Nalnish took his sister's hand, and the old woman began leading them away from the hidden spring toward a trail that wound between towering red rocks toward the eastern horizon. As they walked away from their underground escape route, Mason couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Something moved in the shadows between the rocks. Not soldiers this time, but something else. Apache scouts, perhaps, or other travelers who had observed their emergence from the sacred spring. Whatever was out there, it was following them, now staying just far enough away to avoid direct confrontation, but close enough to track their movement across the desert landscape. Mason loosened his revolver in its holster and tried to project an alertness that might discourage any hostile intentions, but he knew they were vulnerable out here in the open country. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western mountains when the old woman finally stopped at a junction of several game trails. She spoke to Nalnish for several minutes, gesturing toward different paths, while explaining something that seemed to involve complex navigation through the maze of canyons and mesas that stretched ahead of them. When she finished, she embraced both children in turn, speaking words that needed no translation, blessings, encouragements, prayers for safe travel. Then she turned to Mason, studying his face once more with those penetrating eyes that seemed to see directly into his soul. She reached into a pouch at her waist and withdrew something wrapped in soft deerskin. Unfolding the leather revealed a small medicine bundle, sacred items that Mason recognized as powerful protection in Apache tradition. She placed it in his hands while speaking words that Nalnish translated with obvious awe. She give you medicine power to protect children on journey. She say spirits speak to her in cave. Tell her you are chosen one who will bring balance to broken world. She say carry this with Nahale's arrow, and both will guide you when path becomes unclear. The old woman stepped back, raised her hand in a gesture of farewell, and disappeared into the rocks, with the same silent grace she had shown throughout their underground ordeal. Within moments, it was as if she had never been there at all, leaving only the memory of her assistance and the weight of her parting gift in Mason's hands. She show me way to mother, Nalnish said, pointing toward a narrow canyon that cut deep into the eastern cliffs. But she also tell me danger ahead. Wakiza not trust white men since peace council fail. We must be very careful how we approach his people. As if to emphasize his words, a rifle shot cracked across the desert from somewhere behind them, followed by the sound of shouting voices. Mason spun around, scanning the landscape for any sign of the threat, and saw dust rising from a distant canyon mouth where mounted figures were emerging at a gallop. Soldiers, Nalnish asked, his hand moving instinctively toward the knife at his belt. Mason shaded his eyes against the afternoon sun, studying the approaching riders. Too far away to make out details, but the disciplined formation and steady pace suggested military training. Whether it was Harrow's patrol or another cavalry unit, the result would be the same if they were caught in the open. Time to go, Mason said, grimly scooping Ashki up in his arms as they began moving toward the canyon entrance at the fastest pace she could manage. Behind them, the dust cloud was growing larger as their pursuers gained ground across the desert floor. The race for the hidden stronghold of Wakiza's people had begun. The canyon walls rose around them like the ribs of some ancient giant, their red sandstone surfaces carved into fantastic shapes by centuries of wind and flash floods. Mason carried Ashki, while Nalnish ran beside them, all three moving as quickly as exhaustion and rough terrain would allow. The sound of pursuing hoofbeats echoed off the stone walls behind them, growing steadily closer despite their desperate pace. How much farther? Mason gasped, his wounded shoulder screaming in protest as he adjusted Ashki's weight in his arms. The little girl had lapsed back into semi-consciousness, her body going limp as shock and exposure took their toll. Nalnish pointed toward a narrow side canyon that branched off to their left, barely visible unless you knew where to look. There, grandmother's friends say follow watermarks on stone-fined path that go up to Hidden Valley. Mason could see the faint mineral stains that marked ancient flood levels on the canyon walls creating a subtle trail that led toward the branching passage. But he could also see that reaching it would require crossing an open stretch of canyon floor where they would be completely exposed to anyone following their trail. The rifle shot that cracked through the afternoon air confirmed his worst fears. The bullet struck sparks from the rock wall just above their heads, sending sharp fragments raining down on them as they dove for cover behind a fallen boulder. "Carter!" Captain Harrow's voice boomed across the canyon, amplified and distorted by the echoing stone walls. "Give it up. You're trapped in there with nowhere to run." Mason peered carefully around the edge of their makeshift shelter, counting the soldiers who had spread out across the canyon entrance. 6 men, all mounted and armed with military rifles that could pick off targets at considerable range. Harrow sat his horse in the center of the formation, his uniform still neat, despite their hard ride across the desert. "You've got something that belongs to us, Carter." Harrow continued, his voice carrying the supreme confidence of a man who believed he held all the advantages. "Those Indian children are witnesses to what happened at the Peace Council. Can't have them spreading lies about how their leaders died now, can we?" Mason felt Nalnish tense beside him as the boy understood the implications of Harrow's words. They weren't just hunting a deserter, they were here to eliminate anyone who could contradict their official version of the massacre. "What we do?" Nalnish whispered, his young face pale with fear, but his eyes still showing the fierce determination that seemed to run in Apache blood. "They have horses, many guns. We have nowhere to go." Mason studied their tactical situation with the calculating mind that had kept him alive through years of frontier warfare. The soldiers controlled the canyon entrance, but they would have to dismount and approach on foot if they wanted to dislodge 3 people from strong cover. The branching canyon was perhaps 50 yards away, but crossing that distance would mean running through a gauntlet of rifle fire from experienced marksmen, unless there was another way. Mason looked up at the canyon walls towering above them, searching for any possible escape route. The red sandstone was weathered into natural handholds and ledges, and he could see what looked like a narrow shelf running along the wall about 30 feet above the canyon floor. If they could reach it, they might be able to work their way to the side canyon without exposing themselves to direct fire, but it would mean leaving Ashki behind, at least temporarily. She was in no condition to make such a climb, and Mason couldn't carry her up a sheer rock face while dodging bullets. "Nalnish," Mason said quietly, "can you climb?" The boy nodded without hesitation. Apache children learn to climb before they learn to walk. "Why?" "I need you to get up to that ledge, work your way to the side canyon, and find your people. Tell them what happened, bring help if you can." "No." Nalnish's refusal was immediate and absolute. "I not leave, sister. We stay together or we die together, Apache way." Mason felt a flash of frustration, but also a grudging respect for the boy's loyalty. In Nalnish's place, Mason wasn't sure he would have made a different choice. "Carter," Harrow called again, "I'm losing patience. Come out now with those children and I'll make it quick. Keep hiding and I'll make sure you all die slow." To emphasize his point, another rifle cracked this bullet, striking the boulder they crouched behind and sending stone chips flying. Mason could hear the soldiers spreading out, trying to get angles on their position from multiple directions. That's when Mason heard it, a sound so faint he almost missed it over the echo of gunshots and shouted commands. A whistle low and melodic that seemed to come from the canyon walls themselves. Nalnish heard it too, his head snapping up with sudden hope. "Apache signal," the boy whispered excitedly. "Someone here, someone watching." The whistle came again, this time from a different direction, and Mason realized they were surrounded by more than just Harrow's soldiers. Apache warriors had infiltrated the canyon, moving through terrain they knew better than any white man ever could. "Your people?" Mason asked. Nalnish listened intently to a series of soft whistles that seemed to communicate complex information through variations in pitch and rhythm. His expression shifted from hope to confusion to something approaching awe. "Oti," he whispered as if the name itself held power. Wakiza's war chief, best fighter, best tracker, best warrior in all Apache lands. But why he come here? Before Mason could speculate, the answer became brutally clear. The canyon erupted in the distinctive crack of Apache rifles firing from concealed positions, the sound bouncing off the walls in a continuous thunder that made it impossible to count individual shots. Mason saw one of Harrow's soldiers pitch backward from his saddle, then another as invisible marksmen found their targets from impossible angles. "Ambush!" Harrow screamed, wheeling his horse toward what he thought was cover. "Form up! Return fire!" But there was nothing to return fire at. The Apache warriors were ghosts in the rocks, firing from positions that offered no clear targets, while commanding perfect fields of fire over the trapped cavalry patrol. Within seconds, half of Harrow's men were down, and the rest were struggling to control panic-stricken horses while trying to locate enemies they couldn't see. Mason pressed himself and the children closer to their boulder as bullets began flying in both directions, ricochets screaming off the canyon walls with deadly unpredictability. One of the wounded soldiers was calling for his mother in a voice that made Mason's stomach clench with unwanted sympathy. A shadow fell across them, and Mason spun with his revolver half drawn before recognizing the figure crouched on the boulder above their heads. The Apache warrior who dropped silently to the ground beside them was everything Naalnish's odd whisper had suggested: tall, powerfully built, with the fluid grace of a man equally comfortable in battle or hunting. His face was painted with traditional war markings, and his dark eyes held the cold intelligence of a natural killer. But it was the way he looked at the children that told Mason this was no ordinary raid. There was recognition in those eyes, and something deeper: responsibility, perhaps even love. The warrior spoke rapidly to Naalnish in Apache, his voice urgent but controlled despite the battle raging around them. The boy responded with equal speed, gesturing toward Mason and explaining something that made the warrior's eyes narrow with interest. He wanted to know why white soldier protect Apache children. Naalnish translated. "I tell him about peace council, about wolves, about cave. He say..." The boy paused, listening to more rapid Apache speech. "He say you are Bilagana, that grandmother dream about the one who walked between worlds." The warrior Aote Mason assumed studied him with an intensity that felt like being examined under a microscope. Mason met his gaze steadily, one hand resting protectively on Ashki's shoulder, while bullets continued to crack overhead. Finally, Aote spoke again, his words carrying a note of decision. Naalnish translated with obvious relief. "He say we go now, while soldiers busy fighting for their lives. He take us to Aponi, your mother, but first we must reach safe place where wounded can be healed." As if summoned by his words, more Apache warriors materialized from the rocks around them. Mason counted at least 8 men, all armed with a mixture of traditional weapons and captured military rifles. They moved with the coordinated precision of troops who had fought together for years, covering each other's movements while maintaining devastating fire on the surviving cavalry soldiers. One of the warriors scooped Ashki into his arms with practiced gentleness, speaking to her in soothing Apache words that seemed to penetrate her semi-conscious state. Her eyes fluttered open, and instead of the fear Mason expected, her face showed recognition and relief. "Uncle," she whispered in English, the first word she had spoken since their ordeal in the underground river. The warrior smiled, and Mason saw genuine warmth transform his face from that of a killer to that of a loving relative. This wasn't just a rescue, it was a family reunion that had been interrupted by war and tragedy. Aote gestured for Mason to follow as the group began moving toward the side canyon, using the ongoing battle as cover for their escape. The remaining cavalry soldiers were pinned down now, unable to pursue even if they had been inclined to try. Mason took one last look back at the chaos they were leaving behind. Captain Harrow was still alive, crouched behind his dead horse and firing blindly at muzzle flashes that appeared and disappeared like deadly fireflies among the rocks. Their eyes met across the battlefield, and Mason saw in Harrow's face the promise of a reckoning that would come someday somehow. Then they were around the bend in the canyon, following a trail that seemed to exist more in the Apache's collective memory than in any physical markings on the stone. The sound of gunfire faded behind them, replaced by the whisper of moccasined feet on rock and the soft voices of warriors communicating in their ancient language. The side canyon wound upward through increasingly narrow passages, the walls sometimes closing in so tightly that they had to move in single file. Mason marveled at how the Apache warriors navigated this maze with complete confidence, never hesitating at the numerous branches and dead ends that would have confused anyone unfamiliar with the route. After what felt like hours of climbing, they emerged onto a broad shelf that overlooked a hidden valley Mason would never have believed could exist in this harsh desert landscape. Springs fed a series of natural pools that created an oasis of green in the red rock wilderness. Traditional Apache dwellings were scattered among groves of oak and pine that somehow found purchase in the thin soil, and Mason could see gardens where corn beans and squash grew in carefully tended plots. But it was the woman who came running toward them that captured Mason's attention completely. She moved with the same fluid grace he had seen in Aote and the other warriors, but there was something else in her bearing, an authority that spoke of someone accustomed to being listened to, respected, even feared when necessary. "Aponi," Naalnish called out, breaking free from the group to run toward the woman. "Shima, mother." The reunion that followed was both joyful and heartbreaking to witness. Aponi gathered both children into her arms, speaking rapidly in Apache, while tears streamed down her face. But even as she held them, Mason could see that something was wrong. The woman's face was flushed with fever, and her movements showed the careful control of someone fighting serious illness. When she finally looked up at Mason, her dark eyes held a mixture of gratitude and wariness that he was beginning to recognize as the standard Apache reaction to any white man who appeared in their territory. Aote approached and spoke to her in their language, clearly explaining the circumstances that had brought Mason to their hidden refuge. As he talked, Aponi's expression shifted from suspicion to something approaching wonder. She reached out and touched the obsidian arrowhead at Mason's throat, her fingers tracing its smooth surface while she whispered words that sounded like prayers. "She say Nahale speak truth in his vision." Naalnish translated, his voice filled with awe. "She say you are Tarak Nilchi protector who walk in darkness, and that spirits bring you here to heal what was broken." Before Mason could ask what she meant, Aponi began walking toward one of the larger dwellings, gesturing for them to follow. Inside, Mason found himself in what was clearly the living space of a medicine woman. Bundles of dried herbs hung from the roof poles, pottery vessels contained various powders and liquids, and the walls were decorated with symbols that seemed to hold deep spiritual significance. But it was the figure lying on a bed of woven mats that drew Mason's immediate attention. An Apache man, perhaps 40 years old, lay unconscious with wounds that told the story of a recent battle. Bullet holes in his chest and shoulder had been carefully cleaned and bandaged, but infection was clearly setting in despite the traditional treatments that had been applied. Aponi knelt beside the wounded man, speaking to him in gentle Apache words, even though he couldn't hear her. When she looked up at Mason, her eyes held a desperate hope that made his heart ache. "Wakiza," she said simply, and Mason understood. This was the war chief, the leader of these people, and he was dying from wounds that Apache medicine alone couldn't heal. "Bullets still inside," Aponi continued in careful English. "Must come out or poison kill him, but I—" She gestured helplessly at her own fevered condition. "Too sick to do surgery. Hands shake, eyes not clear." Mason looked down at Wakiza's still form, remembering the battlefield medicine he had learned during his years with the cavalry. He had removed bullets before sutured wounds, even performed emergency amputations when army surgeons weren't available. But those had been white soldiers, men who trusted him and his abilities. This was different. This was the leader of a people who had every reason to hate and mistrust anything a white man might do to help them. "Why me?" Mason asked quietly. "You have other medicine people, other healers." Apache spoke in Apache to Aote, who had remained silent throughout the exchange. The war chief responded with obvious reluctance, his words carrying undertones of argument and disagreement. "Aote say it too dangerous," Naalnish translated. "He say white man medicine maybe kill chief faster than Apache medicine. But mother say Nahali's vision show white soldier with medicine knowledge come to save our people when all seem lost." Mason looked around the dwelling, taking in the faces of the Apache warriors who had gathered to watch this unprecedented moment. Some showed cautious hope, others barely contained hostility, and a few displayed the careful neutrality of people waiting to see which way the wind would blow. "If I try to help him and he dies," Mason said carefully, "what happens to me?" The question hung in the air like smoke from the sacred fire that burned in the center of the dwelling. Aote spoke first, his words sharp and definitive. Several other warriors nodded agreement with whatever he had said. "Aote say, if Wakiza die under white man's hands, you die too," Nalnish translated with uncomfortable honesty. "But if you not try to help and he die from bullets, you also die. Apache way responsibility come with power to help." Mason felt the weight of impossible choices settling on his shoulders once again. Everything that had happened since the massacre at the Peace Council had led to this moment, this decision that would determine not just his own fate, but potentially the future relationship between these Apache people and any white men they might encounter. The obsidian arrowhead grew warm against his chest as he knelt beside Wakiza's still form, examining the wounds with practiced eyes. One bullet had passed through the shoulder muscle without hitting bone that one would heal cleanly with proper care. But the chest wound was more serious. The bullet lodged somewhere near the lung and causing internal bleeding that traditional remedies couldn't address. "I'll need clean water, sharp knives, something to use as thread for sutures," Mason said, making his decision, "and someone to hold him still if he wakes up during the procedure." Apone's face lit up with relief and gratitude, but she moved carefully as she began gathering the requested supplies. Her own illness was clearly more serious than she was letting on, and Mason realized he might be dealing with 2 patients before this was over. As Apone and several other women prepared the makeshift surgical area, Aote approached Mason with an expression that mixed warning and grudging respect. "You brave man or very stupid man," the war chief said in careful English. "Maybe both. But Apone believe in Nahale's vision and Wakiza her husband, so I let you try. But know this, you fail, you die. No mercy, no second chance, Apache way." Mason nodded his understanding, then began the careful process of cleaning his hands and examining his makeshift instruments. The knives were sharp obsidian blades that would cut more cleanly than most steel, and the sinew thread would hold sutures better than anything he had used in army field hospitals, as he prepared to begin the surgery that would determine all their fates. Mason became aware of voices outside the dwelling, excited, frightened voices speaking rapidly in Apache. Aote stepped to the entrance and listened intently, his face growing dark with concern. He spoke sharply to one of the younger warriors who ran quickly toward the hidden valley's defensive positions. Then he turned back to Mason with an expression that made the scout's blood run cold. "Soldiers coming," Aote said grimly. "Many soldiers with big guns that throw fire. They find trails, somehow follow us here, maybe 1 hour before they reach valley entrance." Mason felt his heart sink as he realized what this meant. While they had been focused on the immediate crisis of Wakiza's condition, a larger threat had been approaching, probably the main cavalry force that Harrow had mentioned, equipped with artillery that could rain death down on the hidden refuge. "How many?" Mason asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. Ayote conferred with the messenger, who had brought the news, his face growing grimmer with each exchanged word. "Scout count 40 soldiers, maybe more," he reported. "2 big guns on wheels, many horses. Too many to fight in open battle. We must use valley defenses, hope they cannot find way in." But Mason could see in the war chief's eyes that he didn't believe their defenses would be enough. This hidden valley might provide shelter from small patrols, but it wouldn't stand up to a determined assault by a full cavalry company with artillery support. Apache spoke urgently to her husband's unconscious form, her hands trembling as she arranged the surgical instruments. Even in their desperate situation, she was still focused on saving the man she loved, still believing that somehow Mason could work the miracle that would bring him back from the edge of death. "Wakiza must live," she said in English, looking directly into Mason's eyes. "Without him our people scatter like leaves in wind. With him we fight together, maybe survive together. You understand?" Mason understood completely. He was being asked to perform surgery under battlefield conditions, while an enemy force approached with enough firepower to level the entire valley. The wounded man's life wasn't just personally important. It was the key to his people's survival as a coherent fighting force. The weight of the obsidian arrowhead seemed to increase as Mason picked up the first surgical knife, testing its edge against his thumb. Outside, he could hear the sound of warriors taking defensive positions, preparing for a battle that would probably be their last. But inside this dwelling, surrounded by people who had every reason to hate him, Mason Carter prepared to do the most important work of his life. Whether Wakiza lived or died, whether the valley fell to the approaching cavalry or somehow survived the assault, this moment would define everything that came after. As Mason made the first incision, beginning the delicate work of extracting a bullet from near a man's heart, Ashki stepped forward and took his free hand in both of hers. Her small fingers were warm and steady, and when he looked down at her, she smiled with complete trust. "Nahale, watch," she said in careful English. "Spirits help. You not alone." Outside, the sound of approaching hoofbeats grew louder as destiny closed in on all of them, like the jaws of some enormous trap. But inside the medicine lodge, Mason Carter worked with hands that had learned steadiness in a dozen frontier battles, guided by knowledge earned through years of keeping wounded men alive in impossible circumstances. The bullet had to come out. Wakiza had to live. And somehow, against odds that would have made a sensible man despair, they all had to survive what was coming. The obsidian blade moved with surgical precision through Wakiza's flesh, Mason's hands steady despite the distant thunder of approaching cavalry. Blood welled around the incision, but Apache was there immediately with clean cloths, her fevered hands trembling only slightly as she assisted with the delicate procedure. "Deeper than I thought," Mason murmured, probing carefully for the bullet that had lodged near the war chief's lung. The metal fragment had to come out completely. Any pieces left behind would cause infection that would kill Wakiza as surely as leaving the whole bullet in place. Outside, the sound of defensive preparations continued. Warriors called to each other in urgent Apache, positioning themselves among the rocks and narrow passages that provided the valley's natural fortification. But Mason could hear the underlying tension in their voices, the awareness that they were preparing for a battle they couldn't win through conventional means. Mason said with satisfaction, feeling the forceps close around the flattened bullet. The extraction required steady pressure and careful maneuvering to avoid tearing blood vessels, but the projectile finally came free with a soft sucking sound. Dark blood followed it out of the wound, but not the bright arterial flow that would have meant fatal damage to major vessels. Apache examined the extracted bullet with interest, turning the deformed piece of lead over in her palm. Army bullet, she said grimly. Same kind that kill peace council leaders. Same kind that wound my husband when he tried to protect our people from massacre. Mason began the careful process of suturing the wound closed using the fine sinew thread that would dissolve naturally as the tissue healed. Each stitch had to be perfect, too loose, and the wound would reopen under stress too tight, and it would restrict the natural healing process. How did Wakiza get wounded? Mason asked, partly to keep Aponi focused on assisting rather than dwelling on her own illness, and partly because he needed to understand what kind of battle had brought the war chief to this desperate condition. Aponi's face darkened with memory as she handed him clean bandages. 3 days ago, soldiers attack our winter camp. No warning, no chance to surrender. They come at dawn when people still sleeping start shooting at lodges where families live. Wakiza try to organize defense, get people to safety, but soldiers have too many guns, too many men. Mason felt his stomach clench as he realized what she was describing. While he had been with Harrow's patrol at the Peace Council, other cavalry units had been conducting coordinated attacks on Apache settlements throughout the territory. The massacre of the peace negotiators hadn't been an isolated incident. It had been part of a larger campaign to eliminate Apache resistance entirely. Your children, Mason said carefully as he applied the final bandage to Wakiza's chest. They weren't at the winter camp. Aponi send them to grandmother before attack. Naal-Nish spoke up from where he sat with his sister near the dwelling's entrance. She have dreams, see soldiers coming with fire and death. She tell us take children to safe place. Then she try to reach winter camp in time to warn Wakiza. Mason understood now why the old woman in the cave had shown such detailed knowledge of the sacred hiding places and escape routes throughout this territory. She had been part of a network of Apache elders who preserved the ancient knowledge that kept their people alive in times of war and persecution. A commotion outside interrupted his thoughts. Excited voices speaking rapidly in Apache, followed by the sound of running feet. Aote appeared in the dwelling entrance, his face showing a mixture of hope and desperate urgency. Scout bring news, he reported in English for Mason's benefit. Soldiers stop at canyon mouth, make camp. They not attack tonight, wait for morning light. But they have big guns pointed at valley entrance, ready to shoot anything that try to leave. Mason felt a spark of hope at this unexpected development. If the cavalry was waiting for daylight, it meant they weren't confident about assaulting the valley's defenses in darkness. That gave the Apache defenders time to prepare, and maybe time for Wakiza to regain consciousness and provide the leadership his people desperately needed. Why they not attack now? Aponi asked, voicing the question that was clearly troubling all of them. White soldiers usually not wait when they have advantage. Mason considered the tactical situation from a military perspective. A night assault on fortified positions was always risky, especially in unfamiliar terrain where defenders held every advantage. But there was something else involved here, something that suggested the commanding officer was following a specific strategy rather than simply trying to overwhelm Apache resistance through superior firepower. They want something, Mason said slowly, the pieces beginning to fall into place in his mind. This isn't just about eliminating your people. They want something specific, something they think is hidden in this valley. Aote and Aponi exchanged glances that confirmed Mason's suspicion. There was something here, something valuable enough that the army was willing to risk a difficult assault rather than simply starving the defenders out through siege warfare. What is it? Mason asked directly. What do they think you have that's worth all this trouble? The silence that followed his question was heavy with significance. Mason could see internal debate playing out on the faces around him, the desire to trust him warring with generations of Apache secrecy about their most sacred and valuable possessions. Finally, Aponi spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. Map. That single word carried more weight than Mason would have thought possible. In the context of the American frontier, Maps meant different things to different people. To explorers, they meant knowledge; to settlers, they meant opportunity; to the military, they meant strategic advantage. But to Apache people defending their ancestral homeland, a map could mean the difference between survival and extinction. "What kind of map?" Mason pressed gently. Aponi looked at her unconscious husband, then at Aote, clearly seeking guidance about how much to reveal to the white man who had just saved Wakiza's life. The war chief nodded slowly, making a decision that carried enormous implications for all of them. "Maps show all sacred places, all hidden valleys, all water sources in Apache territory," Aponi explained, "made by our grandfathers, kept safe for 7 generations. White soldiers get this map. They find every place our people can hide, every place we can get water in dry season. They use it to hunt us like animals until none left alive." Mason felt the full weight of what she was telling him. Such a map would be priceless to military commanders trying to complete the subjugation of Apache resistance. It would eliminate the defenders' greatest advantage, their intimate knowledge of terrain that could hide them from conventional forces and provide the resources necessary for guerrilla warfare. "Where is it now?" he asked. Ayote gestured toward a section of the dwelling where elaborate pictographs covered the rock wall, hidden where white men never think to look. But if they bring shamans with them, men who know Apache ways, maybe they find it. The implications were staggering. If the cavalry force outside the valley included Apache scouts, working for the army men who had been bought, coerced, or otherwise convinced to betray their own people, then no hiding place would be safe from discovery. "We have to destroy it," Mason said without hesitation. "If there's any chance they might find it, you have to burn it or bury it or do whatever it takes to make sure it never falls into their hands." The reaction to his suggestion was immediate and heated. Aote spoke sharply in Apache, his voice carrying the outrage of someone whose most sacred beliefs had been casually dismissed. Several other warriors who had gathered in the dwelling added their own angry comments, and Mason realized he had seriously underestimated the cultural significance of what he was asking them to do. "You not understand," Aponi said, with strained patience. "Map, not just paper with lines, is sacred trust given to us by spirits of the land itself. Destroy it, we lose connection to all places of power, all sources of medicine, all knowledge that keep our people strong. Is like asking mother to kill her own children." Mason closed his eyes, feeling the weight of impossible choices settling on his shoulders once again. He was asking these people to sacrifice something that connected them to their spiritual heritage and cultural identity in order to prevent its capture by enemies who would use it to complete their destruction. It was a choice that had no good answer, only different kinds of loss. Wakiza stirred upon his bed of woven mats, a soft groan escaping his lips as consciousness began to return. Aponi was beside him, immediately speaking in gentle Apache, while checking his pulse and examining the surgical site for any signs of complications. The war chief's eyes opened slowly, unfocused at first, but gradually sharpening as he became aware of his surroundings. When his gaze fell on Mason, there was no surprise, only the careful evaluation of a leader assessing a potentially dangerous unknown. Aponi spoke rapidly to her husband in their native language, clearly explaining the circumstances that had brought Mason to their hidden refuge and the surgery that had just saved his life. Wakiza listened without interruption, his eyes never leaving Mason's face as he absorbed the remarkable story of the white soldier who had chosen to protect Apache children at the cost of his own safety. When Aponi finished speaking, Wakiza attempted to sit up, grimacing at the pain in his chest, but refusing assistance from anyone. Mason could see the kind of iron will that had made this man a leader worth following, the determination to show strength even when weakness would have been understandable. "Bilagana," Wakiza said in a voice roughened by pain and medication. "White soldier, you save my life, protect my wife's children, fight against your own people. Why?" It was the same question Mason had been asking himself since the moment he drew his gun on Captain Harrow at the Peace Council. The easy answers, duty, conscience, honor, felt inadequate when spoken aloud to a man whose people had suffered generations of betrayal at the hands of well-meaning white men. "Because killing innocent people is wrong," Mason said finally. "Because your Nahele once saved my life, and he taught me that there are things more important than following orders. Because," he paused, touching the obsidian arrowhead at his throat, "because I think he saw this day coming, and he wanted to make sure someone would be here to make the right choice when it mattered." Wakiza studied the arrowhead with intense interest, his expression shifting to something approaching awe. He spoke a single word in Apache, and everyone in the dwelling fell silent. "Ichi," he repeated in English. "Sacred arrow of the spirits. Nahele carry this for 40 years, never give to anyone. He tell me once that spirits show him vision of white man, who walk between worlds, who bring healing when all seem lost. I think maybe you are this man." Before Mason could respond to this startling revelation, the sound of a military bugle echoed across the valley from the canyon entrance. The clear, brassy notes carried an unmistakable message someone wanted to communicate under a flag of truce. Iot was on his feet, immediately moving to the dwelling entrance to assess this unexpected development. After a moment, he turned back with a puzzled expression. "White flag," he reported. "One soldier riding toward valley entrance, no weapon showing. He want to talk." Wakiza struggled to rise from his bed, ignoring Aponi's protests about the danger to his healing wounds. "Help me stand," he commanded, and the authority in his voice made it clear this wasn't a request. Mason found himself supporting the wounded war chief as they made their way to the dwelling entrance. Outside, the hidden valley was bathed in the golden light of late afternoon, the natural beauty of the place made more poignant by the knowledge that it might all be destroyed within hours. The approaching soldier was visible now, a single figure on horseback, carrying a white flag as he rode slowly up the canyon toward the valley entrance. Even at a distance, Mason could see that the man rode with the confident bearing of an experienced cavalry officer. "I know him," Mason said grimly, recognizing the military posture and the particular horse being ridden. "Major Bradley. He was Harrow's superior before this whole campaign started. Good soldier, but he follows orders without question." Wakiza leaned heavily on Mason's arm as they made their way to a vantage point where they could observe the approaching negotiator. The war chief's breathing was labored from the exertion, but his eyes remained sharp and alert. "What he want you think?" Wakiza asked. Mason considered the tactical situation from a military perspective. The cavalry had the valley surrounded and outgunned, but they were also operating in hostile territory where Apache reinforcements might appear at any time. A prolonged siege would be costly in men and supplies, while a direct assault would be bloody, even if successful. "Surrender terms, probably," Mason replied. "Bradley's not the kind of officer who enjoys unnecessary casualties. He'll offer some kind of deal, safe passage for the women and children in exchange for turning over the warriors and any military intelligence you might have." Wakiza's expression darkened. "And if we refuse, then they'll use those artillery pieces to turn this valley into a killing field. Bradley won't want to do it, but he'll follow his orders if he thinks it's necessary." The major had reached the valley entrance now, sitting his horse just beyond rifle range, while he waited for some kind of response to his approach. Mason could see him studying the defensive positions that had been hastily prepared among the rocks, calculating the cost of taking such a position by force. "We go talk to him," Wakiza decided. "Learn what he offer, what he really want. Maybe find way to save our people without fighting battle we cannot win." Iote immediately protested in rapid Apache, clearly arguing that Wakiza was in no condition for such a dangerous meeting, but the war chief cut him off with a gesture, his voice carrying the final authority of absolute command. "Bilagana, come with us," Wakiza continued, nodding toward Mason. "He know white soldier ways help us understand what really behind their words." Mason felt a chill of apprehension at this unexpected request. Walking out to negotiate with his former comrades while wearing Apache clothing and carrying Apache weapons would be tantamount to announcing his desertion to the entire cavalry force. There would be no going back after such a public betrayal of his military oath. But as he looked around at the faces of the people who had accepted him into their community, a pony with her fevered determination to save her husband Aote, with his grudging respect for a warrior who had proved himself in battle Naalnish, and Ashki, with their absolute trust in the man who had guided them through the desert, Mason realized he had already made that choice days ago in a different canyon when he refused to participate in the massacre of peace negotiators. "I'll come," he said simply. The walk to the valley entrance felt like the longest journey of Mason's life. Every step carried him further from any possibility of returning to the world he had known, deeper into a future that held no certainty except the knowledge that he had chosen to stand with people who treated honor as something more than a word to be spoken at formal occasions. Wakiza walked with visible difficulty, but his bearing remained proud and strong as they approached the waiting cavalry officer. Mason could see recognition flash across Major Bradley's face as they drew close enough for clear identification, followed immediately by the kind of shocked disbelief that comes when the impossible proves to be simply improbable. "Mason Carter," Bradley said in a voice that mixed personal disappointment with professional duty. "Captain Harrow reported you dead, said you were killed resisting arrest after deserting your post." "Harrow has a talent for creative storytelling," Mason replied evenly. "As you can see, the reports of my death were greatly exaggerated." Bradley's gaze shifted to Wakiza, taking in the war chief's obvious wounds and the careful way he held himself to avoid aggravating his injuries. "And you would be Wakiza, I assume, the Apache leader we've been tracking across 3 territories." "I am," Wakiza confirmed in clear English that surprised the major. "And you are soldier chief who bring big guns to kill women and children hiding in sacred place. I'm here under orders to secure this valley and arrest anyone found harboring military deserters or possessing stolen government property," Bradley replied stiffly. "If you surrender peacefully and turn over what we're looking for, I'm authorized to guarantee safe passage for non-combatants." Mason felt Wakiza tense beside him at the mention of stolen government property. The sacred map was exactly what the army had come to find, confirming Mason's earlier speculation about the true purpose of this expensive military operation. "What you think we have that belong to government?" Wakiza asked, with dangerous quiet. Bradley reached into his jacket and withdrew a folded paper, spreading it out so they could see the crude sketch it contained. Mason recognized it immediately as a military intelligence map, showing the approximate locations of Apache settlements, water sources, and travel routes throughout the territory. But it was incomplete, obviously, based on second-hand information and educated guesswork, rather than actual reconnaissance. "We know Apache leaders possess detailed knowledge of this territory that could be valuable for maintaining peace and security," Bradley said carefully. "Maps route information details about resource locations. The government is prepared to offer fair compensation for such information, along with guaranteed safe passage to the reservation lands that have been set aside for your people." Mason had to admire the major's diplomatic phrasing, but he could see the truth behind the polite words. The army wanted the sacred map so they could complete the systematic elimination of Apache resistance, and they were willing to pay for it, rather than fight for it if the price wasn't too high. "And if we not have what you want?" Wakiza asked. Bradley's expression hardened slightly. "Then we'll have to search the valley thoroughly to make sure. That kind of search can be destructive. It would be better for everyone if we could avoid that necessity." The threat was clear enough. cooperate and live, resist and face the kind of overwhelming firepower that would leave nothing alive in the hidden valley. Mason could see Wakiza weighing the impossible choice: surrender the sacred map and betray his people's spiritual heritage, or watch them die defending something that might be captured anyway. "We need time to discuss this among our council of elders," Wakiza said finally. "Morning time, we give you answer." Bradley nodded, apparently expecting this request. "You have until sunrise. After that, I'll be forced to carry out my orders regardless of the consequences." As the major turned his horse and rode back toward the cavalry encampment, Mason could see the weight of leadership settling on Wakiza's shoulders like a physical burden. The war chief had to choose between his people's spiritual survival and their physical destruction, knowing that either choice would mean losing something irreplaceable. They walked back toward the valley in silence, each lost in their own thoughts about the impossible situation they faced. But as they approached the dwelling where Apache waited with growing anxiety, Mason began to see the outline of a third option, one that would require considerable risk and perfect timing, but might offer a way to save both the sacred map and the people who depended on it. "Wakiza," Mason said quietly, "what if there was a way to give the army what they want, without actually giving them what they need?" The war chief stopped walking and turned to study Mason's face with sharp interest. "Speak your thoughts, Bilagaana. Time for clever ideas grows short." Mason looked back toward the canyon where Major Bradley's forces waited with their artillery and overwhelming numbers, then at the hidden valley where Apache families huddled around their fires while warriors prepared for a battle they couldn't win. "The army wants a map," he said slowly, the plan taking shape in his mind as he spoke. "They don't necessarily need the right map. If we could create something that looked authentic, but led them to empty canyons and dry waterholes, it might buy your people time to escape while the cavalry chases false leads across hundreds of miles of desert." Wakiza's eyes lit up with the first hope Mason had seen in them since the negotiations began, but almost immediately practical concerns clouded his expression. "Map must look real, must have details only Apache would know," he pointed out. "And someone must take it to soldiers, convince them it's genuine. Who do this dangerous work?" Mason looked at the obsidian arrowhead in his hand, remembering Nahale's words about the true path becoming clear when darkness fell. Everything that had happened since the Peace Council massacre had led to this moment, this choice that would define not just his own future, but the fate of an entire people. "I do it," Mason said with quiet certainty. "I take the false map to Bradley, convince him it's authentic, and lead his forces on a chase that takes them far away from your people." The plan that began forming in that moment would require perfect execution and considerable sacrifice from everyone involved. But as they returned to share the idea with Apache and the other Apache leaders, Mason felt the same sense of rightness that had guided him when he chose to save 2 children from wolves in the desert night. The path was becoming clear at last, just as Nahale had promised it would. The council fire burned low in the medicine lodge as Apache elders gathered around the sacred map that had been hidden from white eyes for 7 generations. Mason studied the intricate pictographs and symbols that covered the carefully preserved deerskin, marveling at the detailed knowledge it contained about every water source, hidden canyon, and sacred site across hundreds of square miles of desert wilderness. This section here, Apache pointed to a cluster of symbols near the eastern edge of the map, shows the real strongholds where our people can survive even the longest drought. If soldiers get this knowledge, they find places we thought safe forever. Wakiza, despite his wounds, worked alongside Mason to create the deception that might save his people. They traced the genuine routes and landmarks onto a piece of elkide, but subtly altered crucial details, changing the symbols for water sources to indicate seasonal streams that would be dry by the time any pursuing force reached them. marking false caches of weapons and supplies in areas that would take days to search, and most importantly showing the main Apache refuge as being located in a box canyon 60 miles south of their actual position. Must look authentic, Ayotte warned, examining their work with a critical eye. Army scouts study Apache signs for many years. If they see something that not look right, they know it false map. Mason nodded, using his knowledge of military intelligence gathering to anticipate what details would convince the cavalry officers. He added wear patterns to make the hide appear aged, included marginal notations in Apache pictographs that suggested the map had been updated over time, and even created deliberate small tears that indicated battlefield damage. Bradley will have Apache scouts with him, Mason said as he worked. Men who know the territory and can spot obvious deceptions. The map has to be good enough to fool people who understand the real landscape. Nalnish watched the process with fascination, occasionally suggesting improvements based on his own knowledge of how traditional maps were constructed. Grandmother always say best lie is one that mostly truth, he observed. Make false map with real places, just not show where real places actually are. As dawn approached, their desperate deception was finally complete. The false map looked authentic enough to pass casual inspection, contained enough genuine information to convince experts of its validity, but would ultimately lead any military force that followed it into empty desert far from the actual Apache strongholds. But creating the map had been the easy part. Now someone had to deliver it to the waiting cavalry force and convince them it was genuine, a task that would require Mason to walk directly into the hands of men who wanted him dead. There might be another way, a pony suggested as Mason prepared to leave the hidden valley. Send map with someone Bradley not recognize, someone who can claim to be Apache messenger seeking to make deal. Mason shook his head firmly. Bradley knows I've been with your people. If the map comes from any other source, he'll be suspicious. It has to come from me with a story that explains how I got it and why I'm willing to betray the people who saved my life. The story they constructed was simple enough to be believable. Mason would claim that he had been held prisoner by the Apache, forced to treat Wakiza's wounds under threat of death. The false map would be presented as something he had stolen during his captivity, intending to trade it for his freedom and a guarantee of safe passage out of the territory. Wakiza gripped Mason's arm with surprising strength as the former cavalry scout prepared to leave. You do this thing, you cannot come back. Apache people remember Taraknilchi protector who walk in darkness, but white soldiers only see traitor who must be punished. I know, Mason replied quietly, but your children will be alive and your people will be free to find new hiding places while the army chases shadows across empty desert. That's worth whatever happens to me. As the first rays of sunlight painted the canyon walls gold and crimson, Mason walked out of the hidden valley for the last time. Behind him, Apache warriors were already beginning the careful process of evacuating their families to alternate refuges, using secret trails that wouldn't appear on any map the military might capture. The walk to the cavalry encampment felt like a journey through time itself, each step carrying Mason further from the world he had discovered among the Apache people and closer to a reckoning with the consequences of his choices. The false map was hidden beneath his shirt, its deerskin surface warm against his chest, next to Nahele's sacred arrowhead. Major Bradley's sentries spotted him while he was still half a mile from their perimeter, and within minutes, Mason found himself surrounded by armed soldiers whose expressions mixed recognition with undisguised hostility. These were men who had served alongside him for years, shared meals and battles, and the casual camaraderie of frontier military life. Now they looked at him as if he were a dangerous stranger whose very presence threatened everything they believed about loyalty and honor. Well, Captain Harrow's voice carried across the camp as Mason was escorted toward the command area. Look what the desert dragged in. Mason Carter, the great Apache lover, come to rejoin civilization. Mason kept his expression neutral as he faced the man who had ordered the massacre at the Peace Council. Harrow looked older, his face marked by the strain of the pursuit across hostile territory, but his eyes still held the same cold certainty that had made him capable of shooting unarmed negotiators. "Captain," Mason acknowledged with careful politeness. "I'm here to speak with Major Bradley under flag of truce." "Truce?" Harrow laughed harshly. "You're a deserter and a traitor, Carter. The only thing you're entitled to is a rope around your neck." "That's enough, Captain." Major Bradley emerged from his command tent fully dressed, despite the early hour. "Mr. Carter has requested to speak with me, and I'm inclined to listen. Bring him to my tent and post guards outside." Inside the canvas shelter that served as field headquarters, Mason found himself facing the officer he had once respected above all others. Bradley had been the kind of commander who led by example, who cared about his men's welfare while still demanding the highest standards of military discipline. That such a man had been drawn into this campaign of systematic extermination spoke to the political pressures driving the Army's actions against the Apache people. "Sit down, Mason," Bradley said, gesturing toward a camp chair. "You look like hell, if you don't mind me saying so." Mason accepted the offered seat gratefully, suddenly aware of how much the past few days had taken out of him. His shoulder wound ached, his clothes were torn and stained with blood, and dirt and exhaustion sat on him like a physical weight. "I've been better, sir," Mason admitted, "but I'm alive, which is more than I expected when this all started." Bradley poured coffee from a battered pot and offered a cup to Mason before settling behind his field desk. "Tell me what happened, son, and don't leave anything out. I need to understand how we got to this point." Mason had rehearsed this conversation during his walk from the hidden valley, but actually lying to an officer he respected proved more difficult than he had anticipated. The story came out haltingly at first, then with growing confidence as he found the rhythm of deception. He described being captured by Apache warriors after his confrontation with Harrow, being forced to treat Wakiza's wounds under threat of death, gradually earning enough trust to move around the hidden stronghold without constant guards. The false map, he claimed, had been copied from the original during one of his medical visits to the war chief's lodge. "They're planning to abandon the valley." Mason continued, producing the deerskin document from beneath his shirt. "Wakiza knows you have artillery, knows he can't defend the position against a direct assault. This map shows where they're planning to retreat, a network of canyons and hidden water sources that would let them conduct guerrilla warfare indefinitely." Bradley examined the map with the careful attention of an experienced military planner, tracing the indicated routes with his finger, while comparing them to the crude intelligence charts his own scouts had produced. Mason held his breath as the major studied details that could reveal the deception if they didn't match what the Army already knew about Apache territory. "This is remarkably detailed," Bradley observed, "much more comprehensive than anything we've been able to compile through reconnaissance. How did you manage to copy so much information without being discovered?" "They thought I was unconscious." Mason lied smoothly. "I'd been helping a pony treat her husband's wounds, and the medicines she was using made me drowsy. They spread the map out to plan their evacuation route, assuming I was too drugged to understand what I was seeing. But I stayed awake just enough to memorize the key details." The major nodded slowly, apparently convinced by this explanation, but then his expression hardened as he focused on the implications of what Mason was telling him. "If this information is accurate, it represents a significant intelligence breakthrough," Bradley said, "but providing it to military authorities would make you complicit in operations that might result in considerable Apache casualties. Are you prepared for that responsibility?" Mason met the major's gaze, steadily drawing on every ounce of acting ability he possessed to project the kind of moral uncertainty that would be expected from someone in his supposed position. "Sir, I've seen what these people are capable of," he said carefully. They saved my life, treated me with more kindness than I probably deserved, but I've also seen what they're planning, and I know that continued resistance will only lead to more bloodshed on both sides. If providing this information helps end the conflict sooner, maybe it saves lives in the long run." It was exactly the kind of rationalization that Bradley would expect from a decent man caught in an impossible situation, and Mason could see the Major's expression soften slightly as he weighed the moral complexities involved. "What do you want in return?" Bradley asked bluntly. "Because I assume you're not offering this information out of pure patriotic duty." "Safe passage out of the territory," Mason replied. "A horse, supplies, and 24 hours head start before you move against the Apache positions. I don't want to be anywhere near here when the fighting starts." Bradley studied the map for several more minutes, occasionally consulting his own charts and making notes on a separate piece of paper. Finally, he looked up with the expression of a man who had reached a difficult but necessary decision. "I'm prepared to accept your offer," he said formally, "but I want your word as a former cavalry officer that this information is genuine and complete to the best of your knowledge." Mason felt the weight of the deception settling on his shoulders like a physical burden. He was about to swear a false oath to an officer he respected, using his own military honor as a guarantee for information that was deliberately designed to mislead and confuse the very forces he had once served with pride. "You have my word, sir," Mason said quietly, hating himself for the necessity, but knowing that the lives of Apache families depended on the convincing nature of his betrayal. Bradley nodded and called for his aide, rapidly dictating orders that would set the false pursuit in motion. Mason listened with growing amazement as the Major organized a complex military operation based entirely on the deceptive map they had created in the Medicine Lodge just hours before. "Captain Morrison will take 2 companies south toward these canyon systems," Bradley instructed. "Captain Harrow will lead the artillery and supply train along this route here, setting up firing positions to block any retreat through these passes. I'll take the remainder of our force directly to this main stronghold marked on the map." Mason realized with a chill that Bradley was committing nearly his entire command to the pursuit, leaving only a skeleton force to guard the original valley position. If the Apache chose to double back, they could potentially recapture their original stronghold and turn the tables on their pursuers. But he also recognized that this massive commitment of forces was exactly what they had hoped for. By the time the cavalry companies reached their designated positions and realized they were chasing shadows, Wakiza's people would have disappeared into hiding places that appeared on no map the military could ever capture. "Your horse and supplies are being prepared," Bradley continued, returning his attention to Mason. "I'm also providing you with a letter of safe conduct that should get you past any army patrols you might encounter. But Mason—" The Major paused, his expression showing genuine concern for a man he had once considered a promising young officer. "Don't come back to this territory. Too many people want you dead for what happened at the Peace Council. Your only chance is to disappear completely, start over somewhere far from here." Mason nodded his understanding, though he wondered if Bradley had any idea how prophetic those words would prove to be. The man who had been Mason Carter was already disappearing, replaced by someone whose identity would be forged in the choices he made in the hours and days to come. As he prepared to leave the cavalry encampment for the last time, Mason caught sight of Sergeant Kowalski among the soldiers, preparing for the morning's march. The grizzled veteran who had saved his life during the Apache Canyon skirmish was checking his equipment with the careful attention to detail that had kept him alive through 20 years of frontier warfare. Their eyes met across the busy camp, and Mason saw recognition and profound sadness in the older man's face. Kowalski raised his hand in a subtle gesture, not quite a salute, but an acknowledgement that transcended the boundaries of military discipline. It was a farewell between soldiers who had shared too much to let politics and conflicting loyalties destroy their mutual respect. Mason returned the gesture, then mounted the horse Bradley had provided and rode out of the camp with the false map safely delivered and the pursuit about to begin. Behind him, he could hear the sounds of a military force preparing for what they believed would be a decisive campaign against Apache resistance. The irony wasn't lost on him as he guided his horse toward the eastern mountains where the real Apache strongholds lay hidden. He had spent 5 years learning to track and fight these people, and now he was using that same knowledge to protect them from the very forces he had once served. The sun climbed higher as Mason rode through country that was becoming increasingly familiar despite his relatively short time in Apache territory. He could read the landscape now with something approaching the intuitive understanding that came naturally to people who had lived here for generations, seeing the subtle signs that indicated water sources, recognizing the patterns of game trails that revealed the safest routes through difficult terrain, understanding how the interplay of wind and rock created the hiding places that had sheltered Apache families for centuries. By midday, he had reached a high ridge that offered a panoramic view of the territory behind him. Through his field glasses, Mason could see dust clouds marking the movement of the 3 cavalry columns as they pursued the false leads he had provided. Major Bradley's force was heading directly toward the empty box canyon that their deceptive map had identified as the main Apache stronghold, while the other 2 columns spread out to block escape routes that didn't actually lead anywhere important. The sight should have filled him with satisfaction at the success of their deception. Instead, Mason felt only a profound sadness for the waste and futility of the entire situation. Good soldiers were about to spend days or weeks chasing phantoms through hostile desert while the Apache people they sought continued the desperate struggle for survival that had defined their existence since the first white settlers arrived in their ancestral homeland. As he prepared to resume his journey toward the real Apache refuges, Mason became aware that he was no longer alone on the ridge. Apache warriors had appeared among the rocks around him, with the silent grace that still amazed him even after witnessing it repeatedly. But these weren't the faces he recognized from Wakiza's band. These were different men wearing the distinctive markings of a separate group. Their leader approached with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to command, his face painted with symbols that marked him as a war chief of considerable rank. When he spoke, his English was precise and careful, suggesting extensive contact with white settlers and military forces. "You are Tarak Nilchi," the war chief stated rather than asked. "The white soldier who protects Apache children, who heals Wakiza with white man medicine, who leads army away from our hidden places." Mason nodded slowly, uncertain about the intentions of these new arrivals. "I am, and you are Cochise," the war chief replied, and Mason felt a chill of recognition. This was perhaps the most famous Apache leader of his generation, a man whose name was spoken with equal parts fear and respect throughout the entire Southwest. "I come to see for myself the Bilagana, who keeps faith with Apache people even when it cost him everything he once valued." The legendary war chief studied Mason with eyes that seemed to see directly into his soul, evaluating not just his words and actions, but the fundamental character that had led him to make such extraordinary choices. "Wakiza send message," Cochise continued. "He say army pursue false trails you provide, that our people have time to reach safe places. He also say you cannot return to White World, cannot return to Apache World. He ask what we do with man who belong nowhere." It was a question Mason had been avoiding since the moment he walked out of the hidden valley with the false map. He had focused so completely on the immediate need to protect Wakiza's people that he hadn't considered what would happen to him once that mission was accomplished. "I don't know," Mason admitted honestly. "I knew I was giving up everything I used to be when I chose to help your people, but I couldn't live with myself if I had done anything else." Cochise nodded approvingly at this response. "Good answer. Man who no cost of honor but choose it anyway has true strength. But you wrong about one thing, you not belong nowhere. You belong with people who understand value of courage, who respect man, who keep faith even when faith costly." The war chief gestured toward his warriors, and Mason realized they were offering him something he hadn't expected: acceptance into a community that valued character over blood, actions over ancestry. "Apache way," Cochise explained. "We judge man by what he do, not what he born. You prove yourself in battle, in healing, in sacrifice for others. You earn place among our people if you want it. Name we give you, Tarak Nilchi, protector, who walk in darkness, that real name, now more real than name white world gave you." Mason felt tears stinging his eyes as he understood what was being offered. Not just sanctuary, but belonging. Not just survival, but the chance to become part of something larger than himself. Something that honored the choices he had made and the person those choices had helped him become. "What about the children?" Mason asked. "Naalnish and Ashki, safe," Cochise assured him. "All Wakiza's people reached Chiricahua stronghold yesterday. Children tell everyone about Bilagana, who saved them from wolves, who guide them through water tunnel, who sacrifice himself to protect their mother and father. They say you family now, blood family, no matter what color your skin." As if summoned by the mention of their names, two familiar figures appeared among the Apache warriors. Naalnish and Ashki had somehow convinced their elders to let them make the dangerous journey to this meeting, and now they ran toward Mason with the uninhibited joy of children reunited with someone they loved. "Tarak," Ashki called out, using his Apache name with the same natural ease she might use when addressing any family member. "You come home now, mother say you always welcome in our lodge, always have place at our fire." Mason knelt to embrace both children, feeling a sense of completion that he had never experienced in his previous life as a cavalry scout. These young lives he had helped save were now part of his own story, part of the family he had discovered in the most unlikely circumstances imaginable. "Yes," he said quietly, looking up at Cochise and the assembled warriors. "I think I'm ready to come home." The ceremony that followed was simple but profound. Cochise spoke words in Apache that needed no translation, their meaning clear in the rhythm and reverence with which they were delivered. The other warriors added their own voices, creating a chant that seemed to connect Mason not just to the people around him, but to the land itself, to the mountains and deserts that had witnessed this transformation from white soldier to Apache protector. When Nahale's obsidian arrowhead was formally returned to him by one of the warriors who had recovered it from the medicine lodge, Mason understood that he was receiving far more than a simple piece of stone. He was being entrusted with a sacred symbol that connected him to all the Apache people who had carried it before him, all the protectors and healers who had walked the path he was now choosing to follow. As the sun set behind the western mountains, painting the desert sky in shades of gold and crimson that reminded Mason of the first night he had saved the children from wolves, he realized that Nahale's prophecy had been fulfilled in ways the old medicine man probably never could have imagined. The darkness had indeed come, the darkness of war and betrayal, of impossible choices and profound loss. But in that darkness, Mason had found not just the true path, but his true identity. He was no longer the cavalry scout who had followed orders without question, no longer the white soldier who had seen Apache people as enemies to be defeated rather than human beings to be understood. He was Tarak Nilchi, he who protects in darkness, and he had found his way home at last. In the distance, barely visible through the gathering twilight dust clouds, still marked the movement of cavalry columns pursuing the false trails he had provided. Major Bradley and his men would eventually realize they had been deceived, would eventually return to their posts, with nothing to show for their expensive campaign except the knowledge that Apache resistance was more resourceful and determined than they had believed. But by then, Wakiza's people would have disappeared into hiding places that existed in no military map, would have begun the process of rebuilding their lives in refuges that offered at least temporary safety from the forces trying to destroy them. The children were safe. The sacred knowledge remained protected, and Mason Carter had discovered that honor sometimes required abandoning everything you thought you knew about loyalty and duty in order to serve something far more important than military discipline or racial solidarity. As he rode toward the hidden strongholds where Apache families waited around their fires, Mason touched the obsidian arrowhead at his throat and smiled. The circle was complete. The prophecy fulfilled, and the protector who walked in darkness had finally found the light that would guide him through whatever challenges lay ahead. Behind them, the desert wind began to blow, erasing the tracks that might have led pursuing soldiers to this place of transformation, covering their trail with the same protective silence that had sheltered Apache people for countless generations. The land itself seemed to approve of what had transpired here, offering its blessing to the unlikely alliance between a white deserter and the people he had chosen to defend. In the end, Mason realized it had never been about choosing between two different worlds. It had been about discovering that there was only one world that mattered, the world where courage was honored above comfort, where protecting the innocent was valued more than following orders, where family was defined not by blood or birth, but by the willingness to sacrifice everything for those you loved. He was home.